Lonnie's day began like any other in the heart of Denver, Colorado, a city of contrasts where modern skyscrapers and historic brick buildings stood side by side, each telling its own tale of prosperity and struggle. At 23, Lonnie was a fresh transplant from San Diego, carrying the sun-drenched optimism of his coastal hometown with him. Yet here in Denver, under a heavy slate sky and amid the ceaseless hum of urban life, he felt an unsettling isolation that hinted at secrets waiting to be unearthed. He had taken a job at the Wells Fargo Bank located at 3155 E First Ave, a sleek, modern building clad in smooth stucco, its clean lines and minimalist design a sharp departure from the city's older, weathered facades. His morning commute had been uneventful, a bus ride down Colfax Avenue, a street renowned for its eclectic blend of cultures and its storied past. The rattling bus wound its way through pothole-ridden roads near Capitol Hill, a neighborhood that bore both the scars and the triumphs of Denver's many transformations. As he stepped off near his destination, a strange, palpable charge seemed to hang in the air, as though the very atmosphere was warning him of what was to come. Inside the bank, the ambiance was subdued. Employees moved with a quiet efficiency, their expressions a mixture of weariness and polite determination. Lonnie settled into his cubicle, his mind wandering to thoughts of home and the uncertain future that Denver, with its cool modernity and deep-rooted history, had promised him. But as his shift began, the ordinary cadence of a business day was punctured by unsettling signs that something was terribly wrong. At first, it was the peculiar behavior of the customers. A middle-aged woman with eyes darting nervously glanced out the expansive front windows, while a young man clutched his phone and murmured about it on social media, though he offered no details. Lonnie tried to concentrate on spreadsheets and routine transactions, but his gaze kept drifting to the scene outside. Through the tall windows facing E First Ave, he observed a growing throng of people, their movements jittery and filled with an inexplicable urgency. The usual parade of everyday life, a couple of cyclists, a businessman hurrying to his next meeting, had been replaced by a disordered mass of citizens whose faces were etched with dread. It began subtly. A few individuals paused on the sidewalks near Larimer Street, coughing violently, hands instinctively rising to cover their mouths. The sound, echoing off the brick facades of Denver's older structures, set Lonnie's heart pounding. What could cause so many to act in unison, as if bound by an unseen command? His mind raced through possibilities: a chemical leak, an airborne toxin, perhaps the outbreak of an unknown virus. As the day unfolded, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Every few minutes, the wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the ambient noise of the busy city. Ambulances and fire trucks, their lights flashing like ominous beacons, rushed past the bank. The reception area buzzed with hushed conversations and anxious whispers. Words like quarantine and outbreak were muttered under breath, carried on the air like a bitter mist. Lonnie's manager, a gaunt man named Harold, moved with grim efficiency, eyes fixed on a television in the corner that broadcast local Denver news. The headlines were clinical, referring to an unprecedented public health emergency that belied the raw terror building outside. During a brief lull in his work, Lonnie stole a glance out the window. What he saw made his stomach churn. On the busy sidewalk outside the bank, near the intersection of E First Ave and Steel Street, small groups of people huddled together, some speaking in frantic, hushed tones, others standing in a state of frozen shock. In the distance, the distinctive outline of the Denver Coliseum emerged, a once proud structure now seemingly dwarfed by the escalating chaos. The familiar streets of downtown Denver were rapidly transforming into the stage for a horror beyond his comprehension. By mid-afternoon, as Lonnie prepared for his lunch break, the situation had escalated further. The bank's glass doors trembled slightly with every distant explosion or booming command from emergency responders. He gathered his meager belongings, a well-worn leather satchel and a smartphone buzzing with unsettling alerts, and stepped outside into the gathering dusk. The daylight was waning, and the sky above Denver, typically a clear expanse of blue, had given way to swirling, oppressive gray clouds that pressed down like an omen. Across the street, the Denver Galleria, once a vibrant shopping destination, was now a surreal tableau of chaos. Police cars with flashing lights and raised sirens blocked off several entrances, while a grim procession of ambulances formed an uninterrupted line along the mall's perimeter. From his vantage point on E1st Ave, Lonnie could glimpse emergency personnel darting in and out of the building, their uniforms streaked with the day's residue of crisis. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and disinfectant, and an almost tangible terror seeped from every shadow. Lonnie's thoughts churned as he absorbed the unfolding events. Memories of his sunlit days in San Diego, a time when the future was a blank canvas painted in vibrant hues, felt like relics of another life. In contrast, the present in Denver was dark and uncertain, as if the very essence of the city were under siege. There was no time to dwell on nostalgia. Every nerve in his body screamed that survival now demanded a meticulous recording of every detail, every nuance, for the sake of truth. Back inside the bank, whispers of panic began to ripple through the staff. Harold pulled Lonnie aside, his voice low and strained. "I don't know what's happening out there, Lonnie," he said, eyes darting toward the windows, "but I've never seen anything like this. We must be cautious." Lonnie's nod was silent, yet his mind raced through plans for escape and survival. It was clear. The fabric of society was beginning to tear, and they were trapped at the edge of a widening rift. Resuming his work, Lonnie couldn't shake the feeling that every beep of the register and every shuffle of paper was laced with impending doom. His eyes drifted to the familiar Denver landmarks that had started to define his short life in the city. The broad corridors of E1st Ave, the twisting alleys of Lodo, lower downtown, and the modern sharpness of the Denver Art Museum, standing as a relic of the city's proud artistic past. But now these symbols of daily life were overlaid with a pall of fear and uncertainty. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the murmurs outside swelled into a cacophony of shouts, desperate cries, and the pounding of hurried footsteps. Through the bank's windows, the scene outside was surreal and deeply disturbing. People staggered along sidewalks near Broadway and Larimer Street, faces contorted in anguish, as if the city itself were convulsing in terror. The once familiar thoroughfares were now littered with debris, discarded shopping bags, broken glass, and scattered newspapers emblazoned with alarming headlines about the crisis. Lonnie's phone vibrated relentlessly in his pocket. With trembling fingers, he checked the screen. A cascade of frantic messages from friends and family flooded in, each query more panicked than the last. "What's happening? Are you safe? They say it's contagious." The digital world, once a comfort, now amplified the dread, each notification a jolt of adrenaline that underscored the collapsing reality around him. As twilight deepened, the Denver skyline, once a proud display of modern ambition and historical charm, was cloaked in an apocalyptic fog. The urban landscape, marked by landmarks like the Colorado State Capitol on Capitol Hill and the angular lines of the Denver Art Museum, seemed to crumble under the weight of chaos. Lonnie's gaze returned to the pandemonium below, where figures began to move with an unnatural, jerky gait, an unsettling prelude to the horror that was about to break loose. A sudden, shattering noise, glass breaking, cut through the disquiet. Lonnie whipped his head toward the sound, catching sight of a group of figures gathered in the street outside the bank's rear windows, facing the intersection of E1st Ave and Platt Street. Their movements were erratic, their eyes glazed and unseeing, driven by a hunger that was both primal and terrifying. In that moment, Lonnie felt the crushing weight of realization. This was no isolated incident, but the harbinger of a far more sinister outbreak. Every instinct in him screamed to flee, yet he was rooted to the spot, forced to bear witness to the macabre scene unfolding. The figures shuffled with an eerie, disjointed rhythm, as if compelled by an unseen, malevolent force. The sight triggered a wave of nausea and dread. This was no passing anomaly, but the onset of a nightmare that threatened to engulf the city. Retreating back into the bank's relative safety, Lonnie found solace in scribbling hurried notes into a small leather-bound journal. "Something is terribly wrong," he scrawled, the ink bleeding into his frantic handwriting. "Denver is bleeding, and the darkness is consuming everything." The words captured the raw terror and disbelief churning within him. As the day dragged on, every minute was steeped in mounting dread. Inside the bank's muted hum, speculation about the cause of the outbreak grew louder. Whispers of a government experiment gone awry, or even a curse, swirled around him, but Lonnie, with his analytical mind, clung to the possibility of a virus, a pathogen that had turned the familiar cityscape into a den of horrors. Outside, Denver's streets transformed into a shifting landscape of despair. The once bustling corridor of First Ave, with its quaint coffee shops and small boutiques, now lay in disarray. Storefronts stood shuttered, and sidewalks were strewn with the debris of a frantic exodus. The steady rhythm of daily life was replaced by the jarring symphony of sirens, distant screams, and the intermittent moan of something inhuman. In a moment of forced clarity, Lonnie recalled quieter days spent wandering Denver's less trodden paths, strolls through the Denver Botanic Gardens near York Street, or explorations of the historic Five Points neighborhood. Those memories now felt like fragments of another world, one before the city had succumbed to chaos. The past and present collided painfully as he contemplated his next move. By the time his shift ended, Harold's earlier warning echoed in his mind. With one final transaction, a hushed exchange with a visibly trembling customer who whispered urgently, "You must leave now," Lonnie understood that the sanctity of the bank was no longer tenable. His departure was not just an escape, but the first step into an unraveling reality. Stepping out into the cool Denver evening, Lonnie was met by a city transformed. The modern stucco facade of the bank now seemed like a distant memory as he ventured onto First Ave, where each step on the cracked pavement resonated with the eerie chorus of sirens, distant screams, and the unmistakable groans that hinted at something unholy on the move. He passed familiar landmarks, the neon glow of a closed diner near Welton Street, abandoned storefronts along Cherry Creek North, and the flickering lights of a derelict theater on Larimer Street, all of which now served as silent witnesses to the creeping dread. With every step, Lonnie felt the past slipping away, replaced by a grim reality that was both foreign and terrifying. Standing at the corner of First Ave and Welton Street, where the ghostly neon of a shuttered bar cast shifting shadows on rain-slick pavement, Lonnie made a silent vow. He would document every detail of this nightmare, Denver's descent into chaos, the collapse of civilization, and the personal cost of survival. His determination burned like a fragile spark amid the encroaching darkness, a small defiance in the face of overwhelming despair. As the Denver night deepened, the city's landmarks, the Colorado State Capitol glimmering faintly on Capitol Hill, the angular modernity of the Denver Art Museum, and even the distant silhouette of the Rocky Mountains, seemed to stand in stark contrast to the horror unfolding below. Every shadow held the promise of death, every echo whispered of the abyss that was swallowing the city whole. In that shrouded hour, as Lonnie moved deeper into the unknown, he realized that he was no longer a passive observer. He had become a reluctant participant in a horror story that had burst forth from the darkest corners of his nightmares, a tale of urban decay, of human frailty under siege, and of a relentless force that threatened to erase everything he once knew. Lonnie's escape from the bank had been a blur of adrenaline and grim determination. The Denver night had barely begun to reveal its true horrors when he veered away from the bank's modern stucco facade. Now, with the remnants of his orderly life in tatters, he found himself propelled into a world where every second pulsed with danger. His plan was simple: seek sustenance, gather his wits, and, if fate allowed, find other survivors. Yet nothing could have prepared him for what lay ahead. The cacophony of sirens, desperate shouts, and inhuman moans provided a relentless soundtrack to his journey. The streets were choked with chaos. Abandoned vehicles lay strewn along the curb, their hoods steaming in the cool Denver evening. A sudden screech of tires and the guttural growl of an engine startled him. He darted into a narrow alley off Welton Street, seeking cover from the relentless threat that seemed to lurk in every shadow. Pushing through the murky corridor, Lonnie emerged onto Larimer Street, where neon signs from shuttered bars and diners flickered uncertainly. The once familiar glow of the Denver Biscuit Company, a local eatery renowned for its massive, savory biscuits and hearty breakfasts, now hung as a ghostly reminder of normality in a city that was quickly succumbing to madness. The diner's windows were dark and shattered, its inviting warmth replaced by the bleak glare of emergency floodlights. Lonnie's stomach churned, not just from hunger, but from the raw fear that had settled deep within him. As he passed the diner, he caught sight of movement in the peripheral darkness. A ragged figure lurched out from behind a dumpster near the entrance of the biscuit company. The person's skin was pallid, eyes vacant, and mouth agape in a silent snarl. It wasn't long before Lonnie realized that this was no ordinary vagrant. It was one of the infected. Instinct overrode hesitation. Lonnie sprinted back into the relative safety of the street, his pulse racing as he sought refuge behind a toppled trash can. The zombie's ragged footsteps echoed ominously as it shuffled closer, its gaze locked on him with a mindless hunger. Lonnie's hand brushed against the cold metal of a discarded fire extinguisher, a makeshift weapon that might buy him time. With a desperate cry, he yanked the extinguisher free and swung wildly at the creature. The impact sent it stumbling backward, its head snapping to one side with a sickening crunch. But there was no time to pause. The creature's attack had merely attracted others. Before Lonnie could regain his breath, more figures emerged from the darkness. From the depths of a narrow side street, near the intersection of Larimer and 16th Street Mall, a small horde of the undead converged. Their eyes burned with an unholy light, and their movements were jerky and uncoordinated, yet driven by a single, relentless urge. Lonnie's survival instincts kicked in, and he bolted down Larimer Street, weaving through deserted storefronts and debris. The relentless pounding of his heart was matched only by the sound of shuffling footsteps and the eerie chorus of moans behind him. In the midst of his flight, Lonnie's path led him to a narrow passage between a shuttered bookstore on Larimer and a crumbling facade of an old theater. The alley was dimly lit by a flickering street lamp that cast distorted shadows on the walls. Here, the noise of the horde dimmed, replaced by a tense silence that was almost more terrifying than the chaos itself. Lonnie pressed his back against the cold brick wall, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Every second stretched into an eternity as he listened for the approach of more undead footsteps. A distant scream shattered the fragile silence. It was a cry of pain, or perhaps terror, and it reverberated off the graffiti-scarred walls of the alley. With no time to question the source, Lonnie made a snap decision. He had to investigate. Gripping his fire extinguisher tightly, he edged toward the sound, his eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Rounding the corner onto a narrow block near Colfax Avenue, he found a small group of survivors huddled in a doorway of a closed bistro. The bistro, known in quieter times as Tattered Beans, a cozy cafe with aromatic brews and comforting pastries, now stood as a forlorn relic of a bygone era. Inside, a few frightened faces stared back at him. A woman in a stained apron clutched a metal tray, and a young man, his eyes red with fear, gripped a kitchen knife as if it were his last defense. Their voices were hushed, trembling with terror and disbelief. "We were in here hiding," the woman whispered urgently. Then the dead came. "We lost so many, we barely escaped." Lonnie quickly assessed the situation. There was a palpable sense of camaraderie amid the despair, a shared humanity that shone through even in the darkest moments. "I'm Lonnie," he introduced himself, his voice a low, steady murmur despite the chaos. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need to know what's happening." His eyes scanned their fearful expressions, each etched with loss and shock. Before they could reply, a thunderous crash erupted outside the bistro's front door. The survivors jumped, and in the brief moment of distraction, a group of zombies battered their way in. The once cozy interior of Tattered Beans became a battleground. Lonnie acted instantly, shoving a table toward the doorway to block the onslaught. "Get down!" he shouted, pushing the terrified survivors behind him. The firefight that ensued was frantic and desperate. The clatter of broken glass, the grunts of the undead, and the panicked cries of the survivors merged into a chaotic symphony. Lonnie swung the fire extinguisher with precision, connecting with the skull of a zombie whose head split open in a spray of dark, viscous gore. The woman clutched the metal tray and, with trembling hands, began hurling hot coffee at an approaching fiend, the liquid hissing as it met decaying flesh. The young man slashed with his knife, his eyes fierce with the raw determination of someone who refused to be consumed by despair. In the melee, every second counted. Lonnie's mind raced, calculating each move as he dodged grasping hands and fended off snapping jaws. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, a potent cocktail of fear and resolve. As he cleared a path toward a side exit, a particularly aggressive zombie lunged at him. With a cry that was equal parts terror and defiance, Lonnie thrust the fire extinguisher forward. The zombie's head snapped back with a sickening crunch, and it collapsed in a heap of mangled flesh. For what felt like an eternity, the survivors fought their way to the back of the bistro. When the door finally burst open, a cold Denver night greeted them, silent for a heartbeat before the distant moans resumed their relentless cadence. The group stumbled out into the street, shaken and bloodied, yet bound together by a newfound sense of purpose. Lonnie's gaze swept over the faces of his temporary allies. There was fear, yes, but also a steely determination to survive this nightmare. They moved quickly now, with Lonnie at the helm. Their destination was the nearby Denver Galleria, a sprawling shopping center that, despite its current state of chaos, might offer temporary refuge and a chance to gather supplies. The streets were a blur of motion as the ragtag band of survivors sprinted along bustling thoroughfares that now bore the scars of a city in collapse. Neon signs from local eateries such as Biker's Grill and the famed Sam's No. 3 on Colfax Avenue flashed intermittently in the distance. The urban landscape, once so familiar, had been transformed into a gauntlet of peril. As they ran, the group encountered yet another wave of the undead. Emerging from a side street near the intersection of 17th Street and Larimer, a dozen zombies staggered forward. Their low, guttural moans mingled with the pounding of the survivors' footsteps. Lonnie's heart raced as he signaled for the group to split up in a desperate bid to flank the horde. "We need to divert them," he barked. The survivors hesitated only a moment before scattering down adjacent streets, drawing the zombies away in a chaotic, macabre chase. Lonnie ducked into a narrow passage between two derelict buildings. The alley, lined with overgrown weeds and graffiti proclaiming forgotten messages of hope and rebellion, provided a temporary haven. But even here, the threat was never far behind. A lone zombie, having broken away from the main horde, lurched toward him. With a swift, determined movement, Lonnie grabbed a length of rebar lying in the dirt. "Not tonight," he muttered, plunging the cold metal into the creature's chest. The zombie convulsed violently before collapsing silently into the darkness. Reuniting with the survivors was a bittersweet moment of relief. They converged at the base of a concrete overpass on 16th Street Mall, their faces smeared with grime and sweat. In the brief quiet that followed, they exchanged wordless glances, a shared acknowledgement of the terror they'd witnessed and the grim resolve that now united them. Lonnie, ever the reluctant leader, suggested, "We need to move toward the mall. It might be fortified, and we can gather supplies." The group nodded, their eyes flickering with a mixture of hope and despair. Their march resumed with renewed urgency. The path led them past the iconic Denver Art Museum, whose modern lines now looked ominous against the backdrop of a city in decay. Along the way, they encountered pockets of survivors, some cowering in doorways, others frantically scavenging for food and water. In one narrow block near Union Station, Lonnie found a small group barricaded in a corner of a closed bistro that once served as a local hangout. The smell of stale coffee and old memories mingled with the stench of decay. One of the survivors, a grizzled man with sorrowful eyes, warned, "It's not safe out here, but you can't stay in one place for too long." Lonnie understood. Every moment in Denver was a gamble with life itself. The group pressed on, their route illuminated by the intermittent glare of emergency vehicle lights and the sporadic bursts of lightning that split the dark sky. As they neared the Denver Galleria, the streets became even more treacherous. Sidewalks that once bustled with shoppers were now battlegrounds, strewn with debris and littered with the remnants of abandoned lives. The sound of distant explosions and the clash of metal against stone echoed through the corridors of the ruined city. Without warning, a fresh surge of zombies erupted from a side street near the entrance to the mall. This time, the horde was larger, its numbers swelling as if drawn by some dark magnetism. The group scrambled to form a defensive line along a barricade of upturned benches and fallen trash cans. Lonnie's pulse pounded as he scanned for any weak link. Amid the chaos, a young woman in the group was pinned against a wall by a relentless zombie. With a cry that was both anguished and determined, Lonnie hurled a heavy piece of metal pipe, striking the creature with brutal force. The zombie crumpled, and in that moment, the survivors rallied, their collective will forging a temporary bulwark against the undead tide. The battle raged for what seemed like hours. Every clash, every desperate cry, every splatter of gore was a testament to the sheer will to survive. Lonnie moved through the melee like a man possessed, each swing of his makeshift weapon precise, every step calculated. His eyes burned with a mix of fear and determination. The gritty reality of the moment was underscored by the unmistakable humanity of his companions. In between moments of frenetic action, there were brief exchanges of reassurance, a pat on the shoulder, a whispered promise to keep fighting, a shared look that said, "We will make it through this nightmare." Eventually, as if by a twist of fate, the horde began to thin. The relentless assault receded into a haunting echo as the survivors managed to push the zombies back. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and their bodies ached from the relentless combat. For a brief, suspended moment, the dark Denver night seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. Yet the victory was Pyrrhic. Every face in the group was etched with loss and the scars of violence. Gathering their strength, Lonnie and his newfound allies moved into the relative safety of the Denver Galleria. The mall, once a vibrant hub of commerce and community, now stood as a fortress of shattered glass and broken dreams. Emergency lights bathed the deserted corridors in an eerie, pulsating glow. As they made their way through the labyrinthine hallways, the survivors scavenged for supplies, canned goods, bottled water, even a first aid kit or two. The grim reality of their situation was ever present, but in the midst of it all, there was a spark of defiant humanity. Inside a once bustling food court, the survivors found a moment of respite. They gathered around a row of food kiosks, their voices hushed as they recounted what they had witnessed. Lonnie, still clutching his journal, listened intently as an older man recounted how he'd lost his family, and a young woman trembled as she described the collapse of her apartment building. In that dark, echoing chamber of what used to be a social hub, the survivors shared not just their pain but also their resolve. Despite the horror, there was a fierce determination, a promise that even in the face of an all-consuming darkness, the human spirit would fight to endure. The temporary lull in the violence was short-lived. A new wave of moans emanated from the far end of the food court. Lonnie's instincts screamed that the danger was not over. With grim determination, he signaled for the group to disperse into different corridors. "We need to stay alert," he whispered urgently, his eyes scanning the darkened corners for any sign of movement. The survivors, their faces now a mosaic of terror and defiance, moved silently as shadows across the cold tile floors. In a narrow corridor leading to a service exit, Lonnie found himself face to face with a lone zombie. Its eyes were glassy, its face a twisted mask of decay. For a heartbeat, time seemed to slow as Lonnie and the creature locked eyes. Then, with a sudden burst of raw energy, the zombie lunged. Lonnie sidestepped, and using a discarded steel chair leg he'd grabbed moments earlier, brought it crashing down onto the creature's skull. The sickening crunch reverberated through the corridor, and the zombie collapsed in a heap. Yet the threat remained, a constant pulsing reminder that survival was a precarious, endless battle. As the survivors regrouped near a service exit, they made a collective decision to press further into the mall. They needed a safe haven, a place to regroup, rest, and plan their next move. In the midst of the pandemonium, their shared struggle for survival had forged a fragile bond. Lonnie, the reluctant chronicler of this unfolding nightmare, vowed silently that he would document every moment, not just for his own survival, but for the truth of a city that was rapidly crumbling under the weight of an unimaginable horror. The survivors exited the food court into a wider corridor that led to an open atrium. The space, once filled with light and laughter, was now a somber arena of overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the echo of distant terror. Every footstep, every whispered command, resonated with the gravity of their plight. Outside the atrium's expansive glass walls, the Denver night was relentless. The city that had once promised opportunity now threatened only despair. Lonnie, his journal clutched tightly to his side, took a moment to steady his racing thoughts. The weight of the day's events bore down on him, the loss of lives, the ferocity of the encounters, the haunting memory of those who had fallen. But amid the violence and gore, there was also a spark of resilience, a defiant pulse of humanity that refused to be snuffed out. It was in the whispered words of comfort, the determined glances shared between survivors, and the unyielding will to fight against an enemy that knew no mercy. In the waning light of the Denver Galleria, as the survivors gathered near a sealed service door, Lonnie's mind churned with both dread and determination. The outbreak had transformed the city into a living nightmare, and every encounter with the undead only deepened the sense of urgency. The path ahead was uncertain, and the cost of survival was measured in blood and sacrifice. Yet for the first time since the chaos had erupted, Lonnie felt a glimmer of hope, a hope born not of naive optimism, but of the raw, unyielding spirit of those who refused to let darkness win. Slowly, the survivors began to organize themselves into makeshift teams, assigning roles. Some would scout for supplies along the deserted corridors of the mall, others would guard the entry points, and a few would stand ready to provide aid to those wounded in battle. Lonnie, now emerging as an unlikely leader, took a deep breath and addressed the group in a hushed, resolute tone. "We have to keep moving. There's no safe haven in one place for long, but together we can outlast this nightmare." His words, though simple, resonated deeply in the somber silence that followed. In that moment, amidst the ruins of a once thriving metropolis, the survivors found strength in unity, a human connection that defied the monstrous chaos around them. As the group prepared to depart from the relative shelter of the mall, Lonnie took one last look at the devastation that had unfolded. The dark, gritty reality of Denver had been indelibly etched into his soul, a relentless barrage of terror, loss, and the faint, persistent hope that even in the darkest hours, humanity could prevail. With his journal in hand and the weight of countless lives resting on his shoulders, Lonnie stepped out into the night once more, his resolve hardened like the concrete beneath his feet. The survivors fanned out, each heading toward different segments of the city. One group towards the beleaguered streets of Lodo, where familiar landmarks such as Union Station and the historic Denver pavilions now stood as silent witnesses to the carnage. Another towards the outer reaches of downtown, where the promise of shelter mingled with the specter of death. Lonnie's path led him down a side street near the bustling 16th Street Mall, where even in this dark hour, the echoes of Denver's vibrant past whispered through the cold air. Lonnie's pulse thundered in his ears as he burst out from the relative shelter of the Denver Galleria, the chaos of the food court still echoing in his mind. The air outside was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, burning rubber, and decay. Every step he took along East First Ave felt like a march into oblivion. The once bustling street, lined with familiar storefronts and local eateries like Snooze, an AM eatery, and the remnants of the Denver Biscuit Company, now lay abandoned and scarred by the outbreak. The night was alive with danger. Lonnie darted across the cracked pavement, his eyes scanning the darkened corners for any sign of movement. In the distance, the low rumble of an approaching horde sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He knew that every moment counted. The urban landscape of Denver had transformed overnight into a labyrinth of peril and despair. One misstep could mean a violent end. As he rounded the corner at Larimer Street, the neon glow of a shuttered diner, once known for its hearty breakfasts and warm hospitality, flickered in the gloom. The diner's windows, now shattered, offered a glimpse of a once welcoming interior turned into a macabre scene of overturned chairs and splatters of dark stains. Lonnie paused only for an instant to memorize the shattered beauty of chaos before pressing on. A sudden crash shattered the silence. A car had careened into a barricade, the impact reverberated like a death knell. In that moment, a group of zombies emerged from the wreckage, their movements disjointed and relentless. Their eyes were vacant, yet filled with a feral hunger that made Lonnie's skin crawl. He dove behind the remains of a dented vehicle, heart hammering as he clutched a length of metal rebar salvaged from debris. Every muscle in his body tensed as the creatures advanced, their guttural moans mingling with the screeching of metal and the distant blare of sirens. Without warning, one of the undead lunged toward his hiding place. Lonnie reacted, swinging the rebar in a wide arc. The sickening crunch of bone echoed in his ears as the zombie's head snapped back, sending blood and gore spraying onto the cracked asphalt. But even as one threat fell, another took its place. The horde was unyielding, a tide of decayed flesh surging forward from the darkness. Lonnie scrambled to his feet and bolted down the street, his breath ragged and his mind set on survival. The pavement blurred beneath his feet as he raced along East First Avenue, narrowly dodging grasping hands and snapping jaws. In the chaos, he caught glimpses of fellow survivors, a man clutching a broken baseball bat, a woman with a determined glint in her eye, and a young teenager sprinting with no more than a backpack as his shield. Each was etched with terror and defiance, a small human light in the overwhelming darkness. Turning sharply into a narrow alley off Colfax Avenue, Lonnie sought to lose the pursuing horde. The alley was a claustrophobic corridor of graffiti-scarred brick walls and overflowing dumpsters. The stench of rot was overpowering. Here the noise of the undead was muffled, replaced by the echo of his own ragged breathing. Yet even in this momentary respite, he knew that the threat was never far away. A muffled groan at the far end of the alley sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, a lone zombie emerged from behind a stack of discarded crates. Its movements were sluggish, but its intent was clear. Lonnie's heart pounded as he edged closer to the wall, searching desperately for anything to use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a length of broken pipe. The creature staggered forward, its mildewed skin glistening in the faint light. Without hesitation, Lonnie hurled the pipe, striking the zombie squarely in the chest. The impact sent it reeling backward before it crumpled onto the grimy floor, its moans fading into silence. But there was no time to celebrate a small victory. The sound of hurried footsteps and the distant clamor of more zombies grew louder. The alley's exit offered a glimpse of the street ahead, a boulevard lined with remnants of once thriving businesses, now marred by chaos and carnage. Lonnie pressed forward, each step a struggle against the pounding of his heart and the terror that clawed at his mind. Lonnie was met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The street was awash with flickering emergency lights reflecting off broken glass and oil slicks. A group of survivors had gathered near a once popular eatery, Biker's Grill, its windows shattered and its signs swinging in the wind. Desperate faces turned toward him, relief mingling with suspicion. But before any words could be exchanged, a new threat arose. A wave of zombies spilled from a side street, charging forward as if propelled by an unseen force. Their outstretched arms and vacant eyes painted a picture of inexorable doom. Lonnie's instincts roared to life. "To the back!" he shouted to the survivors, who scrambled in panic. Together they bolted toward the rear exit of Biker's Grill, using overturned tables and upturned chairs as makeshift shields. Outside, the relentless onslaught of the undead seemed to amplify. The survivors fought with every ounce of strength they could muster. Lonnie found himself in the thick of the battle once again, a brutal dance of violence. He swung his rebar with surgical precision, each blow an effort to carve a path through the tide of decay. A zombie's milky eyes locked onto him as it lunged, and he countered with a savage thrust, impaling the creature with a force that sent it crashing to the ground in a spray of entrails. Amid the chaos, the human element shone through. A young woman with streaks of blood on her face, wielding a heavy cast-iron skillet, joined the fray. Her determined eyes met Lonnie's as she swung her weapon, sending a zombie reeling back with a resounding clang. Together they formed an unspoken alliance. Two survivors in a hellish tableau, determined to hold back the tide of death even as it crashed over them. They fought their way through the labyrinthine streets, the cityscape morphing into a battlefield where every block was a potential death trap. The group's route took them past the iconic Denver Art Museum, its modern lines now ghostly silhouettes against a backdrop of urban ruin. Where storefronts once teemed with life now lay as silent, crumbled relics. Every street corner bore witness to the horror that had gripped Denver, a city in freefall. In a narrow side street near the bustling intersection of Broadway and Larimer, the survivors paused for a breath. The area, once vibrant with the sounds of commerce and laughter, was now eerily silent, save for the intermittent groans of nearby zombies. Lonnie crouched behind a stack of discarded crates and scanned the area. In the distance, a dilapidated food truck, its faded logo proclaiming El Rancho Tacos, offered a grim reminder of normalcy lost. It was there that one of the survivors, a gaunt man with tear-streaked cheeks, murmured, "I used to come here every Tuesday. Now it's just ghosts." The human toll was evident in every broken face and every tear-stained glance. Lonnie felt a pang of sorrow for the world that had been, one filled with laughter, community, and hope. But there was no time for lamentation. The shrill sound of a siren wavered in the distance as another horde emerged, this time from a side passage leading to the historic Lodo, lower downtown district. The group knew that they could not linger. Survival demanded movement. With grim resolve, Lonnie rallied the survivors. "We keep moving," he urged, his voice hoarse yet commanding. "There's no safe place here for long. We need to get to a more secure location." His words were a beacon in the encroaching darkness, a reminder that even in a city overrun by the undead, humanity still clung to the spark of resistance. They surged forward through the darkened streets, weaving between obstacles and fallen debris. The relentless pace was punctuated by brutal encounters. At one point, as they neared the intersection of East First Ave and Cherry Creek, a particularly vicious zombie burst from a collapsed storefront. Its eyes, clouded with madness, locked onto a young survivor clutching a battered backpack. Lonnie reacted in a heartbeat, barreling toward the creature. With a powerful swing of his rebar, he smashed the zombie's skull, the crack of impact a grim punctuation in the ongoing struggle for survival. Time blurred as the night wore on, a never-ending sequence of violence, narrow escapes, and fleeting moments of camaraderie. The survivors' path led them toward a derelict community center on the outskirts of downtown. The building, once a hub for local events and gatherings, now loomed as a dark fortress against the chaos. Its doors were barred and windows smashed, but it promised a temporary refuge from the relentless onslaught. Inside the community center's cavernous foyer, the survivors collapsed in exhausted heaps. For a brief moment, the violent symphony of the streets was replaced by heavy, ragged breaths and the distant drip of leaking water. Lonnie sank to the floor, his back against a cold concrete wall, and allowed himself a fleeting moment of reflection. His journal lay open on his lap, the hastily scrawled words a testament to the night's horror. Denver is a shattered mirror reflecting humanity's despair, each shard a story of survival, of loss, of defiance. But even here, in this fragile sanctuary, the threat was never far away. The moans of the undead seeped through the broken windows and under the barricaded doors. Every creak of the building, every distant thump on the pavement, sent a ripple of tension through the survivors. The sense of camaraderie, forged in the crucible of battle, was tempered by the knowledge that they were merely delaying the inevitable. Lonnie's mind raced as he planned their next move. "We can't stay here," he whispered to a nearby survivor, a middle-aged woman whose eyes betrayed both fear and fierce determination. "This building is a stopgap. We need to get back out there, find a way to escape this maze of death." Her nod was slow but resolute, a silent agreement that the struggle for survival was far from over. With a renewed urgency, the group gathered what little supplies they could salvage, a few bottles of water, a half-empty box of granola bars, and even a battered first aid kit. Lonnie's thoughts drifted momentarily to the world before the outbreak, a Denver filled with music, art, and vibrant street life along Colfax, Broadway, and the 16th Street Mall. Now, those streets were battlegrounds where every shadow concealed another threat. As they prepared to leave the community center, a sudden, blood-curdling scream shattered the fragile calm. It came from the far side of the building, where a lone figure stood amid shattered glass and twisted metal. Rushing to the source, Lonnie and a couple of survivors burst into a narrow corridor where they found a young man cornered by a pair of zombies. The creature on the left clawed at his leg while the one on the right reached hungrily for his face. Without a moment's hesitation, Lonnie charged forward. Swinging his rebar with desperate force, he struck the zombie clinging to the man's leg, sending it sprawling. The other creature lunged as he pivoted, and a sharp cry of pain cut through the air. In a savage, adrenaline-fueled motion, Lonnie drove the rebar into the zombie's skull. The creature's head splintered, its blood spraying against the grimy wall. The young man collapsed, gasping, as the immediate threat subsided. Amid the chaos, the survivors gathered around him, offering whispered reassurances and quickly bandaging his wounds with makeshift materials. Every encounter, every brutal confrontation with the undead, served as a stark reminder of the fragility of their existence. Yet in each act of violence, there was also a flicker of humanity, of survivors fighting not just for themselves, but for one another. This raw determination became their common bond, a shared will to resist a world that had succumbed to darkness. Re-energized by their hard-won survival, the group moved out of the community center and onto the streets once more. The night had deepened, and a cold drizzle began to fall, washing away some of the blood and grime, but doing little to cleanse the pervasive sense of dread. The survivors made their way along the deserted corridors of Denver's back streets. They passed by the remnants of local icons, an old Bojangles on Colorado Boulevard, a shuttered Wingstop with neon signs sputtering in the rain, and even the skeletal remains of a once popular burger joint near Capitol Hill. Every step was fraught with peril. In one narrow stretch between two crumbling apartment buildings in the Lodo district, a fresh horde ambushed them. The surge was sudden and overwhelming. Zombies poured from dark doorways and broken windows, their ragged moans merging into a deafening roar. The survivors scattered, taking cover behind upturned dumpsters and broken concrete barriers. Lonnie's heart pounded as he fought to regain control of the situation. With each swing of his rebar and each desperate thrust of a salvaged kitchen knife, he carved a path through the relentless tide of death. The struggle was visceral and chaotic. Limbs flailed, grunts of pain mingled with the shattering of glass, and in every burst of violence, the thin thread of humanity was both tested and reaffirmed. In the midst of the carnage, Lonnie caught sight of a familiar face, one of the survivors from earlier, a young woman with determination who had been separated from the group. With a cry, he dashed toward her, fending off grasping hands and snapping jaws along the way. Together, they managed to break free from the horde, ducking into a narrow side street. The street, usually lined with trendy boutiques and chic cafes, now bore the scars of the outbreak. Storefronts were smashed, and debris was scattered like confetti over the rain-soaked pavement. In that desperate moment, as the rain mixed with blood and tears, the city of Denver revealed its true face, a brutal, unforgiving landscape where survival was now a daily battle. Lonnie's mind churned with memories of a different Denver, one filled with the aroma of fresh coffee from local favorites like Crema Coffee House and the chatter of people on busy weekends. Now, those memories were replaced by the staccato rhythm of combat, the ceaseless threat of the undead, and the raw, unyielding will to persevere. As the group finally reached a more open street near the bustling heart of downtown, they paused briefly to catch their breath. The constant barrage of zombie encounters had left them bruised and bloodied, but also united in purpose. Lonnie, standing at the center of this battered band of survivors, felt the weight of the night's events settle over him like a heavy shroud. Yet, amid the horror and carnage, there was a fierce glimmer of hope, a promise that, no matter how many times the darkness closed in, the human spirit would continue to fight. The night had grown even darker as Lonnie and the ragtag band of survivors pressed onward through the shattered remnants of Denver's streets. Every step was a battle against despair and death, a relentless race against a tide of undead horrors. Their path wound along East 1st Avenue, past flickering neon signs of once vibrant eateries like Biker's Grill and Crema Coffee House, now nothing more than grim relics of a happier past. But in the midst of the chaos, the survivors clung to a fragile spark of humanity, determined to outlast the horror. Lonnie led the group through a maze of crumbling storefronts and alleyways, their hurried footsteps echoing off graffiti-stained brick walls. The night's relentless barrage of zombie encounters had taken its toll. Clothes were torn, faces smeared with blood and sweat, yet every grimace and every ragged breath spoke of defiant survival. The group's latest refuge had been a dilapidated warehouse near the intersection of Colfax and Broadway. It was there they paused for a few moments, just long enough to catch their breath and regroup. But Lonnie's restless eyes betrayed a man who knew that respite was a luxury they could ill afford. A rusted sign on a nearby building, once proudly proclaiming Milo's Diner, now swung in the chill wind like a specter from another era. Lonnie's mind flashed back to memories of simpler days in Denver, where the warm glow of diner booths and the clatter of coffee cups lent comfort to long winter evenings. Now, those comforts had been replaced by the incessant moans of the undead and the metallic taste of fear. The survivors gathered their meager supplies, a few bottles of water, scraps of canned food, and the remnants of makeshift weapons, when a strange, distant rumble shattered the temporary calm. It was not the sound of approaching footsteps or a siren's wail, but something far more ominous. The unmistakable groan of an engine and the clatter of old metal over broken pavement. Lonnie exchanged wary glances with the others, his pulse quickening as he signaled for silence. With stealth born of desperation, the group edged toward the source of the noise. Rounding a corner near the decrepit remains of a closed-down fast food joint on East First Avenue, they came upon an unexpected and chilling sight: an abandoned school bus, its once bright yellow paint now faded to a ghostly pallor and streaked with grime and dried blood. The bus sat eerily under a flickering streetlight, its large metal body a macabre vessel in a city drowning in horror. "Stay alert," Lonnie hissed, gripping his salvaged rebar as they approached. The bus's battered windows were fogged over and smeared with streaks of rust and something darker, splashes of crimson that hinted at past violence. The survivors clustered close, each breath held tight as Lonnie reached for the bus's door. Its paint peeled in jagged strips, and the door creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo with the voices of lost souls. Inside, the stale, suffocating air was punctuated by the sickly sweet odor of decay. The bus's interior was shrouded in darkness, except for the harsh beams of the survivors' flashlights cutting through the gloom. Every seat was overturned, the floor littered with debris and shredded remnants of what once might have been children's backpacks or lunchboxes. But nothing prepared them for the scene that lay beyond. As Lonnie's trembling hand pushed the bus door wider open, a grotesque tableau unfurled before them. The aisle was choked with figures, small, twitching forms that moved with a terrifying, unnatural speed. These were not the lumbering zombies they had encountered before. These were something altogether more horrifying. They were zombie children, their eyes glassy and devoid of recognition, their movements frantic and predatory. Ragged school uniforms clung to their emaciated frames, and their small hands clawed at the air as they moved with a disturbing, predatory urgency. A guttural, high-pitched moan erupted from one of them as it scrambled toward the light. In the sudden, shocking moment, the survivors recoiled in horror. The children's skin was ashen and mottled, streaked with the unmistakable marks of decay, and their expressions were twisted into a rictus of hunger. The air inside the bus grew oppressively cold, as if the innocence of youth had been replaced with a feral brutality. Without a moment's hesitation, chaos erupted. One of the children, faster than any undead Lonnie had encountered before, lunged from the narrow passage between seats, its small hands slashing through the air. Lonnie reacted instantly, swinging his rebar with all his might. The metal connected with a sickening crunch, sending the child's small body sprawling across the blood-stained floor. But the assault had only begun. Lonnie's heart pounded as he darted forward to assist, his every movement a desperate bid to contain the nightmare that had emerged from the bus. The narrow aisle became a battlefield, a confined space where every swing, every thrust was a struggle for survival. Blood and bile mixed on the floor as the children's once innocent features were twisted by the ravages of their undead state. In one particularly harrowing moment, a child's small hand clutched at Lonnie's pant leg, its grip surprisingly strong despite its size. He jerked away, the contact leaving a smear of crimson on his worn jeans, as the creature's eyes burned with a relentless hunger. With a savage cry, Lonnie drove his makeshift weapon into the child's torso, the sickening crunch and spray of blood punctuating the grim symphony of battle. The other survivors followed his lead. Every swing of a pipe or heavy object met with the horrifying resistance of these once cherished beings, now turned into instruments of death. Outside the bus, the relentless Denver night showed no mercy. The group's shouts and the gruesome sounds from within the bus reverberated through the abandoned streets near Colfax and Broadway. The flashing neon sign of a shuttered eatery, Sam's Number 3, barely illuminated the horror as it danced in broken fragments across puddles of rainwater mingled with blood. For what felt like an eternity, the interior of the bus became a maelstrom of frenetic violence. The children's movements were a blur, a torrent of shrieks, stumbling charges, and desperate clawing that pushed the survivors to the brink of despair. Every swing of a weapon was accompanied by the sound of splintering bone and tearing fabric, as the innocence of youth was obliterated in a moment of unrelenting savagery. Amid the fray, one of the survivors, a middle-aged man named Daryl, who had once been a gentle schoolteacher, found himself fighting tears as much as zombies, his face contorted in anguish as he struck down another child who had managed to surge too close. When the last echo of shrill moans finally subsided, the bus's interior lay in a grotesque stillness. The once crowded aisle was now a macabre canvas. Torn uniforms, shattered limbs, and pools of dark, coagulated blood told the tale of the harrowing battle. Lonnie's chest heaved with exertion as he surveyed the devastation, a scene that would haunt his dreams for years to come. But there was no time to linger on grief. The distant sounds of approaching zombies, the relentless tide of the undead outside, reminded them that this gruesome interlude was but a brief respite in a never-ending nightmare. With grim determination, Lonnie barked, "Move out! We can't stay here!" The survivors, their faces etched with shock and sorrow yet hardened by necessity, hastily retreated from the bus. They spilled out onto the rain-drenched pavement of Colfax Avenue, their eyes haunted by the sight behind them. Lonnie's mind raced, a storm of emotions churning beneath his resolve: revulsion, sorrow, and a burning need to survive at any cost. Every step away from the bus was a step into a further descent into the darkness that had claimed their city. The group hurried down the street, their path lit intermittently by the pale glow of emergency vehicle lights and the intermittent flicker of neon from defunct signs. They skirted past the remains of Milo's Diner, its once cheerful windows now dark and broken, and ducked into a narrow side street off Larimer, a route they hoped would lead them to temporary safety. The rain began to fall harder now, each drop washing away traces of blood, but never the memory of what they had just endured. As they moved, the survivors' whispered conversations and shared looks revealed a deep, unspoken truth. Even in the midst of unspeakable horror, their humanity endured. Tasha wiped away tears with a grim determination. Daryl muttered quiet apologies over his trembling hands. And Lonnie, journal clutched tight against his chest, vowed silently to document every brutal moment so that the truth of this shattered world would not be forgotten. Their journey through the ruined streets of Denver was a relentless gauntlet of danger. At one point, while darting down a side alley near the remains of a once popular burger joint on Capitol Hill, they were ambushed by a fresh wave of zombies. The alley, narrow and choked with debris, became a crucible of survival as Lonnie and his companions fought desperately. The clamor of battle, screams, thuds, and the sickening sound of bone meeting metal reverberated against the crumbling walls. In a moment of desperate clarity, Lonnie rallied his band once more. "We need to push forward," he urged, his voice gruff with exhaustion and determination. "Find a place to regroup, somewhere we can fight back without being cornered." His words were met with solemn nods and steeled expressions. They pressed on, weaving through the labyrinth of destroyed storefronts and broken pavement. They passed by the skeletal remains of a once thriving community center, its charred walls and shattered windows a testament to the ferocity of the outbreak. As they emerged onto a wider boulevard near Union Station, the distant wail of sirens mingled with the persistent moans of the undead. The city of Denver, once a vibrant hub of art, music, and culture, now lay under the oppressive weight of a nightmare that would test the limits of every soul who dared to live. For Lonnie, each new encounter was a relentless reminder of how quickly life could be unmade. Yet amid the carnage and despair, every small act of courage, every shared glance of solidarity, every desperate but defiant swing of a weapon, the survivors might be scarred and broken, but they were not defeated. Their struggle was etched into the darkened streets, a brutal epic of human resilience against an enemy that knew no pity. The survivors' desperate escape from the ruined streets of downtown Denver had led them far from the chaos of East First Street Avenue. Under a bruised sky streaked with the dying hues of twilight, Lonnie and his ragtag band pressed westward, their path taking them along the crumbling sidewalks of Larimer and Colfax Avenues. The din of distant sirens and the constant groan of the undead receded only to be replaced by an eerie silence, punctuated by the scuffle of hurried feet and muffled whispers. In the distance, the imposing facade of the Avalon Lowry luxury apartments loomed like a forgotten citadel, an oasis of opulence now overrun by a nightmare. The Avalon Lowry, located on Quebec Street, a broad, once bustling thoroughfare in Denver's upscale district, had long been a symbol of modern luxury and comfort. Now, its reflective glass and pristine lines were shattered by the outbreak. Windows were darkened by grime, and the normally inviting entrance was barricaded with debris and flickering emergency lights. Lonnie's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the building from across the street, his pulse quickening with a mix of dread and determination. In a voice rough with exhaustion and resolve, he addressed the group. "This is our best chance. We raid the Avalon. We take what we need, and we use every apartment as a safe house. Stay sharp, there will be hundreds of them." They moved swiftly down Quebec Street, their footsteps echoing on rain-slick pavement. The taste of fear mingled with the bitter tang of sweat and blood. Local landmarks that once offered comfort now bore scars of the apocalypse. The neon glow of a shuttered eatery, the Gilded Fork, danced across puddles beside crumbling storefronts, and the distant hum of an old jazz club, the Blue Note, provided a grim soundtrack to their march. The survivors clutched improvised weapons, pipes, rebar, and even a broken steak knife from a defunct diner, and kept low, every shadow a potential ambush. They reached the Avalon Lowry without much fanfare, only to find that the luxury apartments were not the silent sanctuaries they had hoped for. As soon as they scaled a side fire escape and crept through a gap in a barricaded service door, a swarm of zombies burst from the corridor. The creatures, drawn by the sound of their intrusion, poured into the lobby like a dark tide. Their ragged moans filled the vast, marble-floored space as they shuffled relentlessly toward the intruders. In the ensuing chaos, Lonnie led the survivors into a narrow service stairwell. Behind him, the cacophony of snarls, shuffling footsteps, and the clatter of overturned furniture echoed like a funeral dirge. "Head for the upper floors," he bellowed, his voice resolute despite the terror etched on every face. "We need to secure an apartment and hold them off." They ascended the stairs in frantic bursts, the narrow, dim corridors of the apartment building twisting into a labyrinth of potential safe havens and deadly traps. At the first landing, a door slammed open unexpectedly. A horde of zombies had taken refuge in the corridor, their eyes clouded with hunger. The survivors barely had time to react. Daryl, the soft-spoken former schoolteacher, swung a metal rod with a desperate fury, cleaving through a zombie's head with a sound that was both gruesome and final. His actions bought the group precious seconds, yet the relentless pressure of the undead pressed in from every side. Lonnie and Tasha, who had become indispensable in the melee, darted down a hallway toward an apartment marked 12B. The door hung slightly ajar, offering a momentary glimpse of interior darkness. With one swift kick, Lonnie forced it open, and the group spilled inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, a modest living room, a cramped kitchenette, and a single bedroom. It was barely enough to shelter them, but it would serve as a temporary sanctuary. For a few fleeting moments, the survivors allowed themselves a collective exhale as they barricaded the door with a heavy dresser and stacked chairs against the threshold. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the metallic tang of blood. Lonnie's journal lay open on a scarred coffee table, its pages now a record of pain, terror, and the raw will to survive. The survivors gathered around, catching their breaths and tending to minor wounds with whatever supplies they had salvaged. In hushed voices, they recounted the horrors of the past hours, stories of lost friends, brutal clashes with the undead, and the chilling moment when luxury became a death trap. But respite was short-lived. Before the survivors could truly relax, a thudding on the door, slow and methodical, sent chills down everyone's spine. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approached, intermingled with ragged, low moans. Lonnie moved to the peephole, his grip tightening on his makeshift weapon. Outside, hundreds of zombies had congregated in the corridor, drawn by the commotion and the scent of living flesh. Their numbers were staggering, a veritable swarm, a sea of decay that threatened to overwhelm the barricaded apartment at any moment. "We can't hold them off forever," Lonnie whispered, his voice tight with resolve. "We need to move. We have to use every apartment as a hideout until we can figure out a way to escape this building." The survivors, their faces etched with despair, yet ignited by a shared determination, nodded in grim silence. One by one, they exited the apartment through windows and alternate doorways, slipping into the hallways like shadows. The building's interior was a network of corridors and stairwells, each room a potential refuge or a trap. Lonnie led a small contingent, himself, Tasha, Daryl, and a few others, through a narrow passageway that led to a series of side apartments. Each door they opened revealed small pockets of abandoned lives. A once familiar family photo here, a scattering of old magazines there, each relic a haunting reminder of what had been lost. They moved swiftly from apartment to apartment. In one, they found a tiny kitchenette with a working radio, its static-filled broadcasts echoing distant reports of similar outbreaks across the region. In another, a bedroom's shattered mirror reflected faces contorted with fear and grief, but also glimmers of hope that perhaps together they could survive. At one point, as they passed through a long, dark corridor that connected multiple units, a sudden shriek shattered the oppressive silence. A door at the end of the hall burst open, and a fresh wave of zombies surged in. This new horde was different, frenetic, fast, and determined. They charged down the corridor with unnatural speed, their feet pounding against the cracked linoleum floor. Tasha and Lonnie exchanged a desperate glance. "We have to make a stand," Lonnie declared, positioning himself in front of a partially closed door leading to apartment 14C. "Seal this room. We'll hold them off as long as we can." The survivors worked feverishly, barricading the door with heavy furniture, shoving a dresser and a stack of mattresses against it. The groans and snarls of the horde grew louder, punctuated by the sound of metal scraping against wood and the panicked shouts of those defending their last refuge. The minutes that followed were a blur of violence and terror. From the other side of the barricade, the zombies pounded relentlessly. One particularly agile creature, its eyes wild with hunger, managed to wedge its decaying limb through a gap between the boards. With a guttural scream, Daryl lashed out with his rod, shattering bone and sending the creature reeling back into the darkness of the hallway. The barricade trembled under the onslaught, and every creak of the wood was a reminder of their precarious safety. Inside 14C, the survivors huddled together. Lonnie's mind raced as he scribbled in his journal by the flickering light of a battery-powered lantern. Avalon Lowry is a fortress of nightmares. Each door, each room, tells a tale of human loss and defiance. Tonight, we are trapped between the echoes of our past and the relentless march of death. Outside, the zombie horde thinned momentarily before a new, bone-chilling sound echoed down the corridor, a chorus of shuffling feet, punctuated by high-pitched, ravenous cries. It was clear that more zombies were converging on the building. The survivors in 14C exchanged grim looks, their eyes reflecting the bleak reality of a world where safety was merely an illusion. As the pounding at the door intensified, Lonnie made a decision. "We can't stay here. We need to move deeper into the building, to the upper floors. There's an exit on the roof. Maybe we can signal for help or find a way out." Tasha, her voice shaking but resolute, nodded in agreement. "We leave as soon as the next lull. Keep quiet and be ready." For what felt like an eternity, they waited in suffocating silence. The sound of the undead pressing against the barricade slowly ebbed and flowed, a constant reminder that at any moment their fragile haven could be breached. Then a brief window of relative quiet came, a heartbeat of calm before the inevitable storm. Seizing the moment, Lonnie motioned for the survivors to follow him as he picked the lock on the barricaded door with a set of stolen keys from a previous scavenge. They slipped out into the corridor, moving quickly and silently. The upper floors of the Avalon Lowry were a maze of long, dim hallways and vacant apartments, many of which bore the trappings of lives abruptly abandoned. A half-finished cup of coffee on a bedside table, a coat hanging in a closet, a child's drawing taped to a wall. Each small detail stoked the survivors' grief and fueled their determination. They ascended a narrow staircase leading to the 4th floor, the sound of their footsteps drowned out by the distant, insistent groans of zombies below. As they reached the landing, Lonnie paused to catch his breath. "We need to secure this floor," he murmured, surveying the array of apartment doors. "Spread out, gather anything useful, food, first aid, anything that might help us survive until we can get off this roof." Over the next several agonizing minutes, the survivors split up. Lonnie and Tasha checked apartment after apartment, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive gloom. In one unit, they found a small cache of canned soup and bottled water, neatly tucked away behind a broken bookshelf. In another, they discovered a first aid kit, its contents miraculously intact despite the surrounding carnage. In a third apartment, a family portrait, smudged with dirt and streaked with blood, served as a silent elegy to lives lost. But there was no time to gather mementos of the old world. As they were piecing together their meager supplies, a deafening crash erupted from the hall. The survivors froze, hearts hammering in unison. The door to apartment Fort C had been battered open once again. From the open doorway, a torrent of zombies flooded in, this time hundreds of them, their numbers overwhelming the narrow corridor with an unrelenting tide. A relentless surge of undead bodies advanced, their eyes vacant and mouths agape in silent hunger. Lonnie's heart pounded as he gripped his rebar, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Everyone, get ready!" he shouted, the sound of his voice barely audible over the cacophony of shuffling feet and the distant clatter of breaking glass. What followed was a maelstrom of violence and despair. The zombies swarmed into the hallway, their movements a chaotic mass of decaying flesh. Tasha and a few survivors took up positions near the door, slashing and striking with every ounce of strength they could muster. Lonnie moved to reinforce the barricade, shoving heavy furniture back into place as the undead battered at it with relentless fury. Every blow was punctuated by sickening cracks, the sound of bones fracturing, of glass shattering under the weight of despair. In the melee, survival became a desperate ballet of life and death. Lonnie found himself face to face with a hulking zombie whose eyes glowed with a ravenous intensity. The creature lunged, and with a guttural cry, Lonnie plunged his weapon into its chest. The impact sent a spray of dark, coagulated blood splattering across the worn carpet. Around him, survivors fought for every inch of space, their screams and the groans of the undead intermingling into a cacophony of raw terror. For what seemed like endless minutes, the corridor became a battlefield. The group fought with a ferocity born of sheer necessity, their actions a testament to the indomitable human spirit even in the face of overwhelming odds. Each swing, each desperate thrust, was laced with the grim determination to survive another minute in a city that had been ravaged by horror. At last, as if by some cruel twist of fate, the horde began to recede. Exhausted survivors, their faces streaked with sweat and blood, watched as the zombies slowly shuffled back into the darkened hallways, leaving behind a trail of devastation. The survivors clung to one another, their relief tempered by the harrowing knowledge that this was but a temporary reprieve. With trembling hands and weary eyes, Lonnie gathered the remnants of his band. "We need to get to the roof," he said, voice low and determined. "That's our only chance of signaling for help, and maybe escaping this nightmare." The group nodded in solemn agreement. They quickly regrouped and made their way toward the service elevator that would take them to the rooftop. The ride was a tense, silent journey, punctuated by the intermittent groans of zombies echoing from below. When the doors finally slid open onto the roof, a cold wind greeted them. The expansive view of Denver spread out beneath them, a shattered panorama of neon lights, ruined streets, and distant plumes of smoke. From this vantage point, the survivors could see the full extent of the carnage. The streets where their world had once thrived, now overrun by legions of the undead. For a brief moment, the survivors allowed themselves a flicker of hope as Lonnie activated a battered radio transmitter salvaged from one of the apartments. Static filled the air, but amid the crackle, a distant voice emerged, a feeble, broken broadcast of a rescue team calling for any survivors. Lonnie's heart leapt, a mix of relief and renewed determination surging through him. "We have a chance," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon, "but we need to hold this roof until they get here." The survivors huddled together, the chill of the night and the gravity of their situation pressing in on them. Even in the midst of devastation, their shared humanity shone through. Whispered words of comfort, steadying hands on shoulders, and the silent promise that they would not give up without a fight. As the hours dragged on, the survivors took turns keeping watch on the rooftop. They moved cautiously along the building's edge, peering down at the relentless tide of zombies that roamed the lower floors and the streets beyond. Every so often, a fresh surge would rattle the building, a reminder that even the roof was no safe haven for long. Lonnie, journal clutched tightly to his side, recorded every detail of the night's siege, the ferocity of the attack in the corridor, the desperate battle within apartment 14C, and the soul-crushing sight of hundreds of zombies spilling into the hall. Each word was a testament to their struggle, a chronicle of a world turned to ruin, and the fierce will to live despite it all. In the final moments before dawn, as the first weak rays of light crept over the Denver skyline, a new sound broke the silence, a sound of distant engines and urgent shouts. The survivors exchanged wary glances, hope flickering in their tired eyes. The rescue team was coming. With hearts pounding and spirits rekindled by the promise of salvation, Lonnie and his band prepared for the next phase of their journey. They knew that the road ahead was fraught with peril and that the nightmares of the Avalon Lowry would forever haunt them. Yet, in that fragile moment of dawn, as the battered survivors gathered on the roof to await rescue, there was an unspoken truth. Even in a city overrun by the undead, the human spirit could endure. The survivors emerged from the grim corridors of the luxury apartments with heavy, determined hearts. Dawn was still a distant memory, and the echo of moaning undead lingered like a curse. Under the pallid glow of a weak pre-dawn sky, Lonnie led the group away from the confines of their temporary hideout. Every step was measured, every heartbeat a prayer, as they navigated broken sidewalks and deserted lots littered with debris from a world undone. They moved in tight formation along ruined avenues, past shuttered coffee shops and abandoned diners whose neon signs flickered intermittently, remnants of a life that now seemed more like a dream. Their eyes remained ever watchful. Each shadow, every overturned car could hide fresh horror. The relentless distant groans of the undead formed a constant, ominous background to their desperate journey. Their path eventually led them to a desolate parking lot, its cracked asphalt and scattered remnants, a silent testament to better times. In this forsaken place, the group began scavenging for anything that might aid their escape. They rifled through rusted piles of forgotten vehicles and abandoned belongings, their actions urgent and hushed. Amid the detritus, a dark silhouette caught Lonnie's eye, a battered SUV partially concealed by a heap of discarded boxes and broken furniture. "It's here," Lonnie whispered, signaling for the others to gather around. As they cleared away the debris, a glimmer of metal caught one survivor's attention. A set of keys lay abandoned on the seat, as if left behind by fate. With trembling hands, Lonnie retrieved the keys. No rumor had heralded its existence, only the cold, hard reality of scavenging in a ruined world. Yet, in that moment, the keys shone like a small beacon of hope amid the darkness. The survivors exchanged wary glances. The SUV, though battered and worn, represented their only chance to break free from the relentless pursuit of the undead. Lonnie slid into the driver's seat and inserted the keys into the ignition. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, thunderous roar, the engine came to life, a deep, mechanical growl that reverberated through the empty lot. The sound was both a promise of escape and a death knell. In an instant, the engine's roar shattered the uneasy silence, echoing off nearby walls and drawing unwanted attention. As if awakened by the metallic thunder, the undead stirred with renewed ferocity. Why? A fresh horde began to converge on the parking lot, their shuffling feet and ragged moans growing louder by the second. In the midst of the chaos, the group rushed to secure the SUV. They hurriedly climbed inside, their hearts pounding with hope and terror alike. But the price of salvation was about to be steep. At the far edge of the lot, one of their own, a quiet, steady member who had often carried the burdens of the group with unspoken strength, had lingered behind. He had been scavenging for extra supplies, his silhouette barely visible as he moved away from the cluster of survivors. In his isolation, he had drawn the attention of a small band of swift, ravenous zombies. A desperate fight erupted a short distance away. The distant roar of the SUV's engine had proven too irresistible for the undead, and as they converged, the lone survivor was suddenly besieged. Shrieks of alarm and the harsh, guttural sounds of combat broke through the tumult. In a brutal, heart-wrenching moment, the lone scavenger, whose name was lost to time, found himself overwhelmed by the swift, biting ferocity of the attacking horde. His struggle was fierce, but ultimately futile. In the ensuing melee, his final cry of defiance was swallowed by the sound of breaking bones and the wet, sickening thud of a body collapsing onto cold pavement. The sight of his comrade's sacrifice sent a shockwave of grief and determination through the remaining survivors. For a heartbeat, time slowed as they watched, helpless, as the horde tore into the man who had risked everything to help them. His loss, raw and unyielding, was a bitter reminder of the cost of their escape, but it also bought them precious moments. With the chaos at its peak around him, Lonnie seized the opportunity. "Get in! Now!" he roared over the clamor, his voice cutting through the noise as he slammed the SUV door shut. One by one, the survivors piled into the vehicle, their faces set in grim determination, despite the tears that glistened in their eyes. The keys, now clutched in Lonnie's shaking hand, were a tangible link to survival amid the carnage. As Lonnie slammed the door, the sound of the SUV's engine roaring to life reverberated across the lot. The beast of a machine jolted forward with violent momentum, tires screeching as they spun across the rain-slicked pavement. Outside, the newly awakened horde surged forward, their anguished moans rising in a grim chorus. The roar of the engine, a beacon of hope for the survivors inside, became the clarion call that signaled their escape. The SUV barreled out of the parking lot, its path a blur of shattered glass and debris. Inside, the atmosphere was a heady mix of adrenaline, sorrow, and raw determination. The survivors clung to each other, their eyes fixed on the rapidly receding scene of carnage behind them. Grief for their fallen comrade mingled with the fierce drive to survive. Each bump on the road, each twist of the wheel, was a defiant rejection of the darkness that had claimed so many lives. Lonnie drove with a singular focus, the vehicle slicing through the ruined streets like a lifeline in a sea of chaos. The city around them was a shattered mosaic of lost dreams and broken promises. Abandoned storefronts and silent cafes, once vibrant with laughter and chatter, now stood as hollow monuments to a bygone era. Their route was dictated by instinct and the desperate hope of outrunning the dead, with each mile carrying them further from the nightmare they had just escaped. Every turn was fraught with danger. The SUV careened along battered roads, dodging obstacles that had once been mere inconveniences but were now deadly hazards. The relentless pounding of tires on wet asphalt was interspersed with the distant echoes of sirens and sporadic bursts of gunfire from other desperate survivors. Lonnie's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning every darkened corner for lurking threats. The engine's roar was constant, a heartbeat of power that both comforted and warned of the peril that lay ahead. Inside the vehicle, the survivors exchanged somber looks. One whispered, "He gave his life so we could have this chance," while another simply nodded, eyes filled with tears that soon hardened into resolve. Each person carried the memory of their fallen comrade like a burning ember, a reminder of what was at stake. The SUV, now more than just a means of escape, symbolized their fragile hope, a desperate bid to outrun the horror and find a safe haven in the chaos. The journey through the ruined city was a blur of heart-pounding action and quiet moments of reflection. The survivors pressed on through desolate neighborhoods where once bustling streets had been reduced to ghostly corridors. The distant hum of the undead, now a constant background score, merged with the engine's powerful growl to create an eerie symphony of survival. Each turn of the wheel was a gamble. Every stop was a risk, but there was no turning back. At one point, the SUV was forced to a sudden halt by a barricade of debris in the middle of a once busy thoroughfare. The vehicle shuddered to a stop, and for a brief, excruciating moment, All that could be heard was the heavy, labored breathing of the survivors and the distant, relentless moaning of the dead. Lonnie's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, watching as the horde continued its slow, inexorable advance. Then, with a deep, determined breath, he pressed on the accelerator, and the SUV lurched forward, surging past the obstacle with a burst of raw power. The survivors' eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, where the ruined skyline of the city slowly receded into the background. There was no time for mourning now, only the relentless drive to survive. Lonnie's voice, low and resolute, cut through the tension. We keep moving. We honor him by surviving. Every mile is for him. In that moment, amid the chaos and despair, a fragile sense of unity emerged among the survivors. Their shared grief became the fuel that powered their escape, a promise that the sacrifice of one would not be in vain. As the SUV raced onward into the uncertain dawn, the survivors clung to each other and to the unyielding hope that somewhere, somehow, there was a future worth fighting for. The city around them was a desolate, shattered landscape of memories and loss, a place where every ruined building and empty street echoed with the ghosts of what once was. Yet, even in this wasteland of despair, the survivors moved forward, propelled by a singular determination to defy the darkness. Their journey was far from over, and every mile brought with it the possibility of new horrors. But in the roar of the engine and the resolute grip of Lonnie on the wheel, there lay the indomitable will of those who refused to surrender. As the first faint light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the SUV rolled onward, its engine a constant, throbbing heartbeat against the silence of a fallen world. Behind them, the echoes of loss and the relentless cries of the undead faded into the distance. Ahead, a future uncertain, yet brimming with the possibility of redemption awaited, if only they could survive the shattered highways of this broken realm. In the aftermath of their harrowing escape, the battered SUV rolled steadily along deserted boulevards, its engine now a constant hum against the backdrop of a broken world. The early morning light filtered weakly through a canopy of dark clouds, casting long shadows over the ruined city. Inside the vehicle, silence reigned for a few long, heavy moments, a silence filled not with calm, but with the weight of loss and the reverberation of memories. Lonnie's knuckles remained white on the steering wheel as he navigated through streets once teeming with life, now reduced to ghostly corridors of abandoned dreams. The survivors, their eyes downcast and reflective, were bound together by the bitter price they had paid. Daryl's sacrifice was a wound that pulsed in every quiet pause, and his absence left an aching void in the group's collective heart. As the SUV glided through a desolate stretch of roadway, Tasha broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost tentative, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile cocoon of remembrance that enveloped them. "Do you remember," she began, "how just a few days ago this city was alive? We'd laugh over coffee at that little cafe downtown." A gentle murmur of agreement passed around the cramped interior. One by one, the survivors began to share their stories, snatches of life before the outbreak, a time when the world seemed filled with promise rather than despair. Marcus, a wiry young man with a quiet demeanor, recalled the sunny afternoons spent skating by the river. "I used to skate along the waterfront every Saturday," he said, his voice soft but laced with a wistful longing. "There was this old boardwalk where the ice cream truck would play that jingly tune. It was my escape from everything." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, the terror of the past few days gave way to bittersweet nostalgia. Next, Lena, who had managed to keep her vibrant spark even in the darkest hours, recounted memories of a lively brunch at her favorite diner, a cozy, neon-lit spot that had once buzzed with the chatter of friends and the clink of coffee cups. "We'd sit by the window and watch people pass by," she said, a small smile playing on her lips as if she could almost see the scene again. "The waitress always knew our orders by heart, and for a while it felt like nothing could ever go wrong." Her words carried the warmth of a world that now seemed impossibly distant. Lonnie himself, the reluctant chronicler of their shattered lives, shared his memories with a heaviness in his tone. "Before all this," he paused, swallowing hard, "I was starting a new life here. I had dreams of building something, of making a difference. I even met someone special, a girl who believed in art and poetry. I never imagined that within days everything would crumble. His gaze drifted to the open window as if seeking solace in the pale morning light outside, a light that seemed too gentle for the harshness of their reality. Silence fell again, deep and reflective, as the group absorbed these echoes of a former life. The SUV's interior, cramped yet filled with the shared warmth of remembered laughter and lost moments, became a sanctuary of humanity amid the wreckage. Each story was a shard of light piercing the darkness, a reminder that even when the world burned around them, there had been beauty, joy, and hope. The conversation was interrupted by the rhythmic pounding of the tires on the wet pavement, a steady beat that seemed to mark their progress toward an uncertain destination. Lonnie cleared his throat, breaking the reverie. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "We owe it to those we've lost and to ourselves to keep moving forward. Daryl gave his life so that we might have a chance. Let's honor him by finding a safe haven and, maybe, rebuilding something out of this mess." A murmur of agreement rose among the survivors, their faces resolute despite the grief that still shadowed their eyes. As the SUV continued its journey through the desolation, the group began to strategize in low, urgent whispers. They debated which routes might be less teeming with the undead, and who among them would take the lead in scouting out potential safe zones. Plans were made to secure supplies, to search for any signs of organized resistance, and even to contact any remaining pockets of survivors who might have found refuge in hidden corners of the ruined city. Marcus, who had earlier spoken of his skateboarding escapades, now volunteered to scout ahead. "I know these streets well," he offered, his tone steady despite the fear that still lurked in his eyes. "I can check out that block over there, see if there's any sign of life or if it's just another graveyard of memories." His willingness to risk further danger was not lost on the others. It was the kind of courage that, even in a world overrun by death, shone like a small ember of hope. Lena suggested that they head toward an old community center that had once been a hub of activity, a place where neighbors had gathered for events, where children had played, and where the laughter of families had filled the air. "Maybe there's something there," she said, her voice imbued with a quiet determination. "It might be fortified, or at least less exposed than out on the open roads." Her words were met with nods, and a tentative consensus formed around the idea of moving toward a structure that might offer temporary shelter and a chance to regroup. The SUV's tires splashed through puddles and splintered along the cracked concrete as Lonnie steered them away from the open highways and into the narrow, winding backroads of the ruined city. Along the way, the survivors passed by dilapidated buildings that once stood as proud symbols of community, places where life had thrived, now reduced to hollow shells. Every shattered window and sagging sign was a silent testimony to the abrupt and brutal collapse of their world. In the quiet that fell between moments of planning and passing memory, the survivors took turns watching the rearview mirror, each glance a mixture of vigilance and wistfulness. The fallen comrade they had lost was not forgotten. His absence was a ghost that lingered in every shared glance and every unspoken prayer. They remembered him not only as a brave soul who had sacrificed himself for the good of the group, but as a man who had once laughed, loved, and dreamed just like they did. As the SUV crept along a narrow street lined with crumbling facades, Lonnie's thoughts drifted back to the days before the outbreak. In his mind, he saw himself sitting in a bustling cafe, scribbling in his journal with a smile as he observed the everyday miracles of life. He remembered how he'd planned to build a future filled with art, passion, and connection, an idea that now felt almost painfully naive. But even as the memories stung, they also fortified his resolve. The promise of what life once was spurred him to imagine what it could be again if they were able to endure this nightmarish ordeal. The conversation turned, too, to the personal losses that each survivor had suffered, small, heartbreaking details that, when woven together, painted a picture of a community that had been full of life and love. One man recalled his mother's gentle smile as she served him hot cocoa on a snowy morning. A young woman spoke of her childhood dreams and the hope she had once held for a future where possibilities were endless. In the soft cadence of their shared recollections, there was a palpable sense of mourning, but also a fierce determination to keep those memories alive, as if the act of remembering could somehow fend off the encroaching darkness. "We have to keep going," Lonnie said, his voice rising above the gentle murmur of remembrance. "We can honor the past by fighting for a future where the stories of who we were can live on, even if everything else has fallen apart." His words, spoken with the authority of someone who had seen too much to allow despair to win, resonated deeply with the group. As the SUV turned a corner and merged onto a less traveled road, the group's plans began to take shape. They discussed splitting into smaller teams to search for supplies and secure safe passages to the community center Lena had mentioned. There were cautious suggestions of contacting other survivors, maybe even finding a way to signal to any remnants of organized rescue efforts. Each idea was weighed carefully against the harsh reality of their situation, a reality where every plan could be thwarted by the ever-present threat of the undead. The atmosphere inside the SUV was charged with a complex blend of hope, sorrow, and determination. The engine's steady hum and the rhythmic thumping of tires on rain-worn asphalt provided a constant, almost meditative backdrop to the exchange of memories and strategies. It was as if, in the midst of chaos, the survivors had found a moment of clarity, a brief respite where they could, together, imagine a world beyond the ruins. Lonnie, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, felt the memory of Daryl like a burning ember in his heart. "Every mile we travel," he said quietly, "is for him and for all of us who have lost so much. We have to believe that somewhere out there, there's a chance to rebuild, to reclaim even a fragment of the life we once knew." His voice was both a vow and a plea, a reminder that in the darkest moments, the human spirit could still find a way to shine through. The SUV rolled on, carrying the survivors deeper into the unknown. Their destination was no longer a fixed point on a map, but a shared aspiration, a hope that beyond the shattered streets and haunted ruins, there was a possibility for renewal. The road twisted and turned through neighborhoods that whispered of once vibrant communities, now silenced by tragedy. Along the way, the survivors continued to exchange stories, anecdotes of childhood adventures, of quiet evenings spent with family, of dreams that once filled the heart with unbridled joy. One survivor, a quiet woman with eyes that had seen too much, recalled a memory of a summer day in the park, a day when laughter echoed among trees and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. "I remember the way the sunlight danced on the water," she murmured, her voice tinged with both melancholy and reverence. It was a reminder that even the smallest moments could be beautiful. Her words hung in the air, fragile and poignant, a delicate reminder of what had been and what might still be reclaimed. As the SUV continued its journey, the survivors' conversation shifted naturally to practical matters. They discussed rationing the meager supplies they had salvaged, planning shifts for lookout duty, and assigning responsibilities for scavenging in the next town, if they could reach one. In these discussions, the inherent humanity of each individual shone through. They were not simply survivors in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. They were people with hopes, dreams, and a profound need to connect, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. In the quiet moments between recollections and plans, Lonnie scribbled in his journal, capturing the delicate interplay of memory and survival. His pen moved steadily, chronicling the vivid recollections, the fleeting moments of beauty, and the shared resolve that bound them together. Each word was a defiant act, a refusal to let the horrors of the present obliterate the memories of a world that once was. By the time the SUV began to slow near the outskirts of the ruined city, the survivors had forged a tentative plan. Their next destination was the old community center Lena had mentioned, a place that, despite its battered exterior, might still offer the safety of walls and a chance to regroup. As the vehicle came to a stop on a desolate road leading away from the heart of destruction, the survivors exchanged solemn glances, their faces etched with fatigue and resolve. "We move out in a few minutes," Lonnie said, his tone both gentle and commanding. "Let's honor our past by fighting for our future. Today we remember, and tomorrow we rebuild." In that charged moment, with the cool dawn light beginning to filter through the clouds, The survivors gathered their belongings. They stepped out of the SUV into a world scarred by chaos, but not yet entirely bereft of hope. The memories of laughter, of long-forgotten summer days, and quiet family dinners buoyed them as they set off toward the community center, a symbol, however battered, of the possibility of renewal. The survivors trudged through the early hours of a desolate morning until the battered SUV finally pulled to a stop in front of a once grand community center. The building, its facade now a crumbling testament to lost prosperity, stood in silent defiance of the chaos that had swept the city. High, arched windows were shattered or obscured by layers of grime, and the grand entrance, once the site of laughter and welcoming chatter, now hung open, revealing a cavernous lobby swallowed by shadows and dust. Lonnie was the first to step out. Every movement was deliberate, each step measured against the weight of exhaustion and grief. Behind him, the remaining survivors emerged slowly from the vehicle. Tasha clutched her frayed jacket close as though it could shield her from the memories the building evoked. Marcus and Lena exchanged solemn glances as they surveyed the dilapidated structure. There was an unspoken understanding between them. This place, despite its ruined state, might offer temporary refuge, a last bastion against the unyielding tide of the undead. Inside, the community center was a vast, echoing space where time seemed to have halted. The lobby's marble floors were streaked with dirt and punctuated by shards of glass. Faded murals on the walls told stories of happier days, when the building had been a hub of community events and celebrations. Now, only the distant sound of dripping water and the occasional scuttle of unseen creatures disturbed the silence. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and neglect, a stark reminder that life had once flourished here before everything changed. The survivors moved in a cautious column, their flashlights slicing through the gloom. Lonnie led the way, his eyes scanning every corner for danger. They passed through a spacious foyer where remnants of once stately furniture lay abandoned. Upturned chairs, broken tables, and a grand chandelier that hung precariously from the ceiling. Each piece of debris seemed to whisper memories of a past filled with laughter and light. After a few moments of tense exploration, they found a large, multi-purpose room at the back of the building. The room was vast, with high ceilings and long, empty rows of chairs that had once hosted community meetings and performances. Here, the survivors decided to establish a temporary command post. They quickly gathered around a long, scarred table and began to set up makeshift barricades using overturned furniture and any available supplies. The group knew that they might only have a few precious hours before the relentless horde discovered this haven. As they worked, the oppressive silence was broken by hushed voices sharing memories, small moments of a life that once was. Lena, her eyes moist with sorrow, traced a finger over a faded inscription on the wall. "I remember when this place was full of light," she murmured. "There were community dances and holiday parties. It feels so far away now." Her voice wavered, carrying the weight of personal loss and a shared longing for normalcy. Marcus, usually the quiet observer, recalled his favorite afternoons spent in the park with his family, his words soft but resonant. "I used to come here after school, laugh with my cousins, and feel like nothing could hurt us. Now, it's just memories and ghosts." His tone was gentle, yet every word was laced with the bitterness of what had been stripped away. Tasha, who had long carried the burden of both fear and resilience, spoke of a simpler time. "I remember mornings at that little cafe where I'd sit by the window, sip my coffee, and watch the world go by. There was warmth, there was hope. We had dreams." The fragments of a once vibrant existence shone briefly in her voice before being swallowed by the harsh reality that now surrounded them. Lonnie listened, his own thoughts heavy. He remembered the new life he had begun to imagine, late nights filled with art, quiet conversations about future possibilities, and a budding romance that had promised a fresh start. Now, all that remained were the stark, painful truths of survival. "We honor those memories," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the sorrow etched in his eyes, "by fighting for a future, even if it seems impossible now." The survivors took a moment to absorb these words, letting the shared memories bind them together. Yet the fragile respite was abruptly shattered by a low, persistent rumble from outside. Through a broken window, the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet and guttural moans grew louder. The undead were drawing near, and every sound in the building seemed amplified by the collective tension. Marcus stepped forward, his voice rising in urgency. "We need to secure all entrances immediately." In response, Tasha and a small team rushed to the front doors, dragging heavy furniture to barricade them, while Lena organized a group to search for additional supplies in the adjacent rooms. The survivors moved as one, a silent, determined force against the darkness encroaching on their fragile sanctuary. Soon, the sound of pounding, thudding against the barricaded front door became almost rhythmic. The zombies, relentless in their pursuit, began to claw at the makeshift barriers. The noise reverberated through the corridors, punctuating the tense quiet of the interior. Every crash against the door sent shudders through the building, and with each impact, it felt as if the last vestiges of safety were slipping away. Lonnie, gripping a heavy metal pipe, stood at the threshold of the multi-purpose room. "Hold your ground," he commanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. Outside, the pressure mounted as the zombies banged and rasped at the barricades. One by one, the defenders of the community center stepped forward to meet the threat, each swing, each cry of defiance a testament to their will to survive. The battle that ensued was fierce and unyielding. The survivors fought with a desperate vigor born of both terror and hope. Marcus, whose gentle demeanor belied a steely resolve, swung his makeshift weapon at a horde that had managed to break through a weak point in the barricade. His actions were swift and resolute, each blow punctuated by the sickening sound of impact as undead bodies collapsed to the floor. Tasha moved with a blend of grace and ferocity, intercepting a lunging zombie before it could reach her, her face set in a mask of grim determination. In the midst of the chaos, time seemed to slow. Lonnie's mind raced as he fought, each movement a blend of raw instinct and practiced skill. Amid the cacophony of shattering glass, splintering wood, and anguished screams, he found a moment of grim clarity. This was not just a fight for survival. It was a stand for the lives they had once known, a desperate bid to preserve the memory of what it meant to be human. For several long minutes, the defenders held their ground. The relentless assault of the undead was met by a barrage of determined strikes. Every thud against the barricade, every rasping moan from the attackers, echoed like the tolling of a death knell. And yet, amid the blood and the chaos, a quiet resilience permeated the group, a shared understanding that even if the world had crumbled around them, the spirit of what they once cherished still lived within. As the battle raged on outside, a lull finally fell over the community center. The pounding at the door diminished to a disheartening throb, and the groans of the attackers grew distant. The survivors, bloodied and exhausted, leaned against the walls of the multi-purpose room, catching their breath in the quiet after the storm. In that fragile moment, Lonnie gathered them together. "We've held on tonight," he said softly, his voice carrying both the fatigue of battle and the quiet pride of survival. "But we cannot stay here forever. We must gather what we can and prepare to move on. The memories of this place, of our past, will guide us, but our future depends on our next steps." There was a solemn nod from each person as they began to tend to their wounds and secure the room once more. Lena, with steady hands, bandaged a cut on Marcus's arm, while Tasha checked on a young woman who had been grazed by a zombie's claw. In the subdued light of the early dawn, their shared pain was palpable, but so was their determination. The survivors spent the next few hours scavenging the community center for any useful supplies. They found remnants of canned food in a storage room, a dusty first aid kit tucked away in a corner, and even a few batteries that might power a radio or flashlight. Every small item was carefully collected, a lifeline in a world where nothing came without struggle. In between tasks, they exchanged quiet words of remembrance, their voices soft in the stillness of the battered halls. Stories of family gatherings, laughter shared with friends, and even the simple pleasure of a warm meal were recounted in hushed tones, each memory a spark of light against the encroaching darkness. Lonnie returned to his journal whenever he could steal a quiet moment. He wrote of the shattered murals, the echoing silence, and the indomitable courage that he saw in each of his companions. His pen moved steadily across the pages, chronicling not only the horror of the present, but also the enduring hope that lay beneath it. "We are the keepers of our own history," he scribbled, "and though the night is long and filled with sorrow, the promise of a new day is worth every sacrifice." As the morning wore on, the defenders of the community center began to plan their next move. It was clear that the building, with all its memories and makeshift defenses, could not be their permanent sanctuary. They needed to push onward, to find a safer place where they could regroup and perhaps even rebuild a semblance of the world they had lost. The plan was tentative, yet filled with a shared determination. They would first gather their supplies, then cautiously exit the community center, using the chaos outside as cover to slip into the relative safety of a nearby abandoned facility that Marcus had mentioned, a place rumored to be less overrun and more structurally sound. Before departing, the survivors gathered one last time in the multipurpose room. With tired eyes and weary hearts, they spoke quietly of the friends they had lost and the memories that would forever bind them together. "We carry the light of those we've lost," Tasha whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "and we honor them by fighting for every new sunrise." Each face in the circle bore the marks of battle and grief, yet in their eyes burned the resolute fire of hope. Lonnie's voice was firm as he addressed the group. "This is our last bastion for now. We hold on, we remember, and then we move forward. Every step we take is a promise that we will rebuild, that we will reclaim what has been stolen from us. Tonight, we fight. Tomorrow, we begin anew." His words were met with nods and quiet murmurs of agreement, a shared pact that no matter how dark the path, they would walk it together. With the supplies secured and their plans set, the survivors finally prepared to leave the community center. They moved cautiously through the building's labyrinthine corridors, gathering their belongings and keeping a watchful eye on every shadow. Outside, the remnants of the undead had dispersed into the early light, leaving behind an eerie silence that was both a relief and a reminder of the ever-present threat. Stepping out into the cool morning air, the survivors felt the weight of their memories and the burden of their responsibilities. The community center, a symbol of both loss and resilience, faded behind them as they set off toward an uncertain future. Every step was heavy, with the echoes of laughter, love, and the simple joys of days gone by, but it was also a step toward a new beginning, a chance to rebuild a world that still held the promise of hope. The road ahead was long and fraught with danger, but together they moved forward with the shared conviction that the human spirit could defy even the most relentless darkness. In the quiet determination of each survivor, in every whispered story of better times, and in the solemn vow to honor those they had lost, there lay the seeds of a future yet to be reclaimed. The SUV's tires hummed against winding back roads as the survivors forged onward, leaving behind the shattered remnants of the city. In the quiet moments between bouts of vigilance, Lonnie's mind replayed the heavy memories of lost friends, the community center's desperate battle, and the raw hope that had sustained them through endless nights. But now, a new plan had crystallized, a beacon of possibility amid the ruin. "We can't stay in the urban ruins forever," Lonnie declared over the steady roar of the engine as the group navigated a series of twisting, rugged roads. "Our next destination is Geneva Glen Camp." His voice carried a mix of urgency and hope. "It's a place far to the west, beyond the mountains, away from the main roads and the relentless hordes. There we'll have safe zones to raid, supplies to gather, and, most importantly, a chance to regroup." A quiet murmur of agreement filled the cramped interior of the SUV. Each survivor's eyes, dark with fatigue yet alight with resolve, met Lonnie's as they silently embraced the plan. Geneva Glen Camp was a place whispered about among scattered pockets of survivors, a rustic, secluded haven nestled in the foothills, hidden by nature and nearly forgotten by the chaos that had overtaken civilization. As the vehicle climbed steep, narrow country roads, the landscape transformed before their eyes. The battered urban sprawl gave way to vast stretches of rolling hills and rugged mountain passes. The air, though still heavy with the distant scent of decay, was tinged with the crisp promise of untamed wilderness. Trees lined the roadside in clusters, their leaves glistening with dew under a rising sun. For a moment, the survivors allowed themselves to breathe in the raw, unspoiled essence of nature, a brief respite from the grim echoes of the city. Marcus, ever the quiet observer, broke the silence. "I remember when I used to hike these hills with my family," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the vast panorama beyond the windshield. "Before everything changed, these roads were my escape, a place to breathe, to be free." His voice carried the weight of a man who had tasted both beauty and loss, and for a heartbeat, the SUV was not merely a metal vessel, but a chariot carrying the last vestiges of their forgotten lives. The journey, however, was not without its trials. As the SUV pressed further into the remote wilderness, the roads grew rougher and less forgiving. Potholes and rocky patches forced Lonnie to slow down, each jolt a reminder that safety was never guaranteed. The group kept a sharp watch for signs of trouble, both on the road and beyond the edge of the asphalt. Every now and then, the sound of distant, unearthly moans would echo up from the valleys below, a stark reminder that even here, the undead could find a way to infiltrate the sanctuary of nature. Tasha, her eyes scanning the horizon, leaned forward. "I can see the mountains now," she noted, a mix of relief and trepidation in her tone. "Geneva Glen Camp should be just over that ridge." Her fingers tapped nervously on the dashboard, as if trying to steady her racing heart. The survivors exchanged glances, each aware that the closer they got to their destination, the more the stakes would rise. As the SUV ascended a particularly steep section of road, the vehicle's engine groaned under the strain. Lonnie's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, his focus absolute. The surrounding landscape burst into breathtaking vistas, rugged peaks, dense pine forests, and hidden meadows that shimmered with morning mist. For a few precious minutes, the beauty of the wilderness offered a fragile counterpoint to the constant threat of death that had defined their recent days. Then, abruptly, the road narrowed into a single-lane passage flanked by steep drops and overhanging cliffs. The SUV crawled forward, its headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness of a forested tunnel. It was here that danger found them once more. A sudden shudder, the scraping of metal against rock, and a piercing screech shattered the fragile calm. A loose boulder, dislodged by the vibrations of the vehicle, hurtled down onto the road ahead. Lonnie swerved instinctively, the SUV skidding dangerously close to the edge. Adrenaline surged through him as he wrestled with the wheel, managing to steer clear of the falling debris. The SUV lurched violently, throwing several survivors against their seatbelts. A collective gasp filled the car before silence returned, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the engine and the fading echo of the boulder's impact. After a tense moment, Lonnie exhaled deeply. "We're still on track," he announced, voice steady despite the lingering shock. The survivors, faces set with renewed determination, nodded in quiet affirmation. Their journey was a testament to the unyielding will to survive, a drive fueled by grief, hope, and the memory of all they had lost. Finally, after hours of winding travel through dense forests and rugged mountain passes, the SUV emerged onto a broad, secluded road that led to the outskirts of Geneva Glen Camp. The camp itself was a sprawling compound hidden among tall pines and craggy hills, a relic of an old summer camp once used for family retreats and wilderness adventures. Now its cabins and communal buildings stood as silent sentinels to a more innocent past, their paint peeling and windows dark, yet offering shelter from the terrors of the outside world. The vehicle rumbled to a stop in a cleared area near the camp's entrance. The survivors piled out, stretching stiff limbs and taking in the surreal sight. Here, far from the clamor of urban decay, nature reigned with a quiet, unyielding majesty. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood and decay they had grown so accustomed to. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes glistening with cautious hope. "This place, it's almost like a sanctuary," he whispered, taking in the sight of an old wooden sign, faded with time, that read simply, "Geneva Glen Camp." In that moment, the survivors allowed themselves a brief taste of relief, a possibility that here, amid the quiet wilderness, they might find a foothold to rebuild or at least plan their next move. But the reprieve was fragile. Lonnie reminded the group that even in isolation, danger could lurk. "We can't let our guard down," he said. "This camp may be away from the hordes, but that doesn't mean it's completely safe. We'll need to scavenge, secure supplies, and fortify what we find." His tone was firm, a leader hardened by loss and tempered by hope. The survivors spread out to explore the camp's perimeter. Tasha, accompanied by Lena, carefully navigated a row of abandoned cabins. Inside one, they discovered remnants of past lives, old photographs, faded journals, and a dusty but still functional first aid kit. In another, Marcus and a couple of others found a stockpile of non-perishable food items tucked away in a storage room behind a loose wall. Each small discovery was a spark of hope, a tangible reminder that even amid despair, remnants of a world that once was could be salvaged. As the group reconvened near a central fire pit, a place that, in the past, had served as the heart of communal gatherings, they shared what they had found. Their voices were low, respectful of the fragile peace that now enveloped the camp. Lonnie pulled out his journal and read aloud a passage he had written during the long drive, a tribute to the fallen and a reaffirmation of their commitment to survive. In the midst of shattered dreams and endless night, we find strength in memories of brighter days. Geneva Glen Camp is more than a refuge. It is a promise that, even when the world is broken, hope can still take root. His words resonated deeply, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the weary faces around him. In that moment, the survivors were not simply a band of frightened refugees. They were keepers of a legacy, a living testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity. The mood in the camp shifted as the group began to plan their next steps. They discussed using the SUV to launch further raids on nearby outposts and abandoned supply caches, places that, while dangerous, might still hold the resources needed to sustain them. They mapped out potential routes, deciding that the isolation of Geneva Glen Camp would serve as a temporary buffer, a place to regroup and strengthen before venturing back into the chaos of the wider world. Tasha, ever the cautious optimist, spoke up. "We need to scout the area around the camp. There might be other survivors out there, or even secure locations we can use to set up a more permanent base." Her suggestion sparked a flurry of discussion, and soon, small teams were formed. One group would patrol the woods beyond the camp, while another would search the nearby abandoned structures for any salvageable supplies. Lonnie, standing beside the SUV, took a moment to survey his weary companions. The lines of exhaustion on their faces were softened by a glimmer of determination. "This is our chance," he said quietly. "We have a safe space here, at least for now. Let's use it to heal, to plan, and to honor the lives we've lost. Every step we take from here is for those who can no longer walk these roads." The survivors dispersed into teams, their movements methodical and cautious as they began their exploration of the camp's periphery. Marcus led a small group into the surrounding woods, their flashlights slicing through the thick canopy. The forest was eerily silent except for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a lone bird, a sound that seemed almost impossible in a world overrun by death. Their objective was clear: to map out safe paths, identify potential threats, and scout for any signs of life beyond the boundaries of the camp. Meanwhile, Tasha and Lena searched through the remaining cabins and outbuildings. In one neglected storage shed, they discovered a cache of tools, hammers, nails, and a few generators, items that could be invaluable for fortifying their new refuge. Lena's hands trembled as she carefully lifted a rusted but serviceable toolbox. "We can rebuild," she murmured, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "We have to believe that we can." Back at the central fire pit, Lonnie sat for a moment, his eyes distant as he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The SUV's presence had been a lifeline, a vehicle that carried them through the carnage of the city and into the embrace of a place that still held a promise of normalcy. But even here, on the fringes of civilization, danger was never far away. The survivors' collective memories of past battles, the sacrifices of friends like Daryl, and the haunting echoes of the fallen fueled their resolve to press forward. As the day wore on, the survivors regrouped near the SUV, sharing the details of their scouting missions. The information was tentative yet filled with cautious optimism. The camp was secluded, with natural barriers provided by dense woods and steep slopes, making it an ideal temporary haven. Moreover, the surrounding area, though scarred by the outbreak, appeared to have pockets of resources that could be scavenged using the SUV as a mobile base. Lonnie gathered the group for a final briefing. "We're going to set up a perimeter around the camp," he said. drawing a rough map in the dirt with a stick. We need watchtowers, barricades, and a reliable plan for any future raids. Our survival depends on staying one step ahead, not just of the undead, but of the world we once knew. His words, firm and resolute, stirred a collective determination in the group. As twilight fell over Geneva Glen Camp, a calm settled over the survivors, a fragile, temporary peace that was both comforting and tenuous. They gathered for a makeshift meal near the fire pit, sharing sparse rations and quiet conversation. In the fading light, each shared a story from the past, a memory of a family dinner, a laugh shared with friends, or a cherished moment of hope. The stories were soft and bittersweet, each one a small rebellion against the encroaching darkness. For a long while they sat together, united by loss and fortified by hope. In that moment, the community that had emerged from the wreckage was not defined solely by pain and struggle, but by the resilient human spirit that dared to imagine a future beyond the ruins. Finally, as the stars began to twinkle in the clear mountain sky, the survivors settled into the relative safety of Geneva Glen Camp. The SUV, now parked near the camp's entrance, stood as a testament to their journey, a lifeline that had carried them from a world of endless terror to a haven where they could plan their next move. Lonnie closed his journal that night with a final, quiet promise written on its worn pages. We have come far from the ashes of despair. Here, in the quiet strength of Geneva Glen Camp, we will rebuild. For every fallen friend, every tear shed, and every dream lost, we fight on. I'm writing this from the heart of Geneva Glen Camp, a place that, 6 months ago, we all feared would be nothing more than a temporary refuge. Now, as I sit here beneath the early morning light filtering through the pines, I can hardly believe the transformation. What once was a desperate scramble for survival has grown into something resembling a real community. I remember the day we first arrived, stumbling into this hidden haven with nothing but our ragged clothes, broken hopes, and the echo of loss in our hearts. Today, I'm proud to say that we've built something here, a spark of hope in a world that had forgotten how to dream. When we landed at the camp, the undead were a constant threat. Every night, stray zombies would wander up from nearby abandoned houses, moaning their way through the darkness. But over time, we learned how to live with that threat. We fortified our perimeter, cleared the immediate area, and slowly, the number of stragglers dwindled. Now, on most nights, I can hear nothing more than the rustle of the wind in the trees and the occasional distant groan, reminders that even in this secluded place, the old world isn't entirely dead. In these past 6 months, our little community has grown. We started with just the survivors from our escape, a handful of souls clinging to life amidst the chaos. Over time, we've raided nearby abandoned houses and supply caches, salvaging food, medicine, and building materials. And then, as if by fate, 6 more people arrived, a mix of wanderers and lost souls looking for safety. They're now part of our team. Together we work as one, each person contributing their unique skills, from repairing broken fences and clearing out stray zombies, to cooking meals over a communal fire and keeping a lookout for any signs of danger. I remember a few days ago, we gathered around a fire pit outside our main shelter, a modest collection of reclaimed wood and stone that we built ourselves. The night was clear, the stars a brilliant tapestry overhead. We shared stories of our lives before all of this began, stories that felt almost surreal now. There was Marcus, who told us about his long summer hikes in the mountains with his family, and Lena, who spoke softly of the bustling coffee shops and vibrant street festivals in the city. I even shared some of my own dreams, the plans I had scribbled in my journal when I first came here, ideas of art shows, poetry readings, and a future where I'd create something beautiful out of all the darkness. Hearing these stories reminded us all of our humanity. Despite everything we've endured, we still remember what it means to live, to laugh, to hope. That night, as we listened to the crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of our voices, it wasn't just survival we celebrated. It was the persistence of life itself. We vowed then that we'd honor our past by building a future, no matter how uncertain the road might be. Our daily routines have settled into a rhythm, a blend of hard work and moments of quiet reflection. Mornings start early with patrols along the camp's perimeter. We've mapped out safe paths through the surrounding woods and set up lookout posts atop the ridges. The sound of distant groans has become a reminder rather than a terror, and every cleared trail is a small victory. Afternoons are spent in communal tasks, repairing our makeshift shelters, tending to our small vegetable garden. Yes, we've managed to grow a few tomatoes and herbs in an improvised greenhouse, and sorting through the supplies we've scavenged from nearby ruins. The SUV that once carried us away from the dying city still sits at the edge of the camp. It's become our mobile lifeline, our connection to the outside world. When we raid abandoned structures or venture out to gather more resources, we use it to transport everything we can salvage. It's a symbol of our escape, a reminder that even when we were at our lowest, we managed to grab hold of hope and drive away from the nightmare. I can't help but think back to the days when I first picked up my pen to document our journey. Every word was steeped in fear and loss, but also in determination. I wrote of nights spent huddled in abandoned buildings, of desperate fights against hordes of the undead, and of the bitter sting of watching friends fall. Daryl, one of our bravest, gave his life so that we could have a chance. I still remember his final defiant cry, a sound that still haunts my dreams. His sacrifice wasn't in vain. It's etched into every decision we make, every barricade we build. We honor him by not giving up, by continuing to believe that there is something worth fighting for. Over these months, I've seen us change. We're no longer just survivors. We've become a community. We share our meals, our hopes, and our burdens. We laugh when we can, even if it's just a small, shaky laugh, and we find moments of beauty in the most unlikely places. A sunrise over the mountains, the first bloom of a wildflower along a dirt path, the simple pleasure of a warm meal after a hard day's work. These are the things that remind us that life, in all its fragile splendor, is worth living. I often walk the perimeter of our camp at dusk, when the sky shifts to hues of gold and purple. It's in these moments that I allow myself to dream again. I imagine a day when we might return to civilization, not to the ruined cities of our past, but to something new, a place built on hope and resilience. I picture our community growing, not just surviving, but thriving. Perhaps we'll start small, with a modest school or a community garden, and slowly, bit by bit, rebuild what was lost. I write these dreams in my journal not as idle fantasies, but as blueprints for our future. There are still challenges. The occasional stray zombie still wanders close to the camp's edge, a grim reminder that the old world isn't completely gone. And while we've managed to secure most of our immediate surroundings, there is always the uncertainty of what lies beyond. The world is vast and unpredictable, and danger can come from anywhere. But together, we face it all with a unity and determination that gives me hope. In our quiet evenings, when the work is done and the fire is low, we gather to share stories. Sometimes we talk about trivial things, memories of favorite songs, the taste of a perfectly brewed cup of coffee, or a childhood game played in a sunlit park. Other times we reflect on the heavier moments, the losses that have defined our journey. Each story is a thread, weaving together the tapestry of our shared humanity. It's in these stories that I find the strength to carry on, a reminder that no matter how dark the night, there is always a spark of light waiting to be rekindled. And so, as I write these words, I feel a cautious optimism stirring within me. We have come so far from that first night of terror when every step was a fight for survival. Now, in the gentle embrace of the mountains, we are beginning to rebuild, not just our shelters, but our lives. We're planning for the future, mapping out routes for further raids, organizing our supplies, and discussing how we might eventually extend our safe haven beyond the boundaries of Geneva Glen Camp. This is not the end of our story. It is merely a new beginning, a pause in the relentless struggle, a moment to breathe and to dream. We know that challenges lie ahead, that the remnants of the old world still lurk in the shadows. But we also know that as long as we remember who we are and the dreams we once cherished, we have the strength to forge a new path. I leave these words as a testament to our journey, a record of our pain, our resilience, and our unwavering hope. For those who come after us and for ourselves, let it be known that in the face of unimaginable horror, we chose to remember the beauty of life. We chose to fight for every sunrise, every shared smile, every small victory against the dark. As I close my journal tonight, the stars twinkle above in the clear mountain sky, a silent promise that even in the deepest darkness, light can be found. Our story is still unfolding, and while I do not know what the next chapter holds, I know one thing for certain: we will face it together, with open hearts and unyielding determination. For now, the future remains unwritten, a blank page waiting for the next chapter of our lives. And as long as hope endures in each of us, I believe that our journey is far from over, to be continued.